The Galactic Academy's morning light filtered through the crystalline walls of Classroom 7 Delta, casting rainbow patterns across the assembled students. Sarah Chen sat in the back row, her human frame appearing deceptively small among the towering Zephyrians and the scaled bulk of the Krex students. At 19 Earth years old, she was one of only 12 humans accepted into the prestigious Interstellar University, a fact that still amazed her parents back on the orbital station above Earth. Professor Velkin, a graceful Etherian with gossamer wings and silver skin, glided to the front of the class. Today's lesson focused on theoretical xenobiology, specifically the adaptation mechanisms of species from high-gravity worlds. Sarah found herself paying closer attention than usual, as Earth qualified as what most galactic citizens considered a death world, a planet so hostile that its native species developed extraordinary survival traits. As we discussed yesterday, Professor Velkin's melodious voice filled the room. Creatures from high-stress environments often exhibit enhanced reflexes, increased bone density, and accelerated healing capabilities. These traits, while advantageous for survival, can make such species appear, she paused delicately, quite formidable to those from more hospitable worlds. Jackson Thurl, a Zephyrian student from the mid-tier seating, turned to sneer at Sarah. His species came from a low-gravity world where conflict was resolved through elaborate verbal negotiations rather than physical confrontation. His pale blue skin flushed darker with disdain as he spoke loud enough for the class to hear. "Theoretical is right," Jackson said, his voice carrying the typical Zephyrian accent that turned every statement into a question. "I mean, look at the human back there. She looks like she could barely lift her own datapad, let alone display any of these supposed death world advantages." Several students turned to stare at Sarah, their various eyes, sensors, and optical organs focusing on her. She kept her expression neutral, having learned early in her academy tenure that reacting to such comments only encouraged more of them. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard academy uniform that somehow managed to look oversized on her compact frame. Professor Velkin's wings fluttered with mild disapproval. "Mr. Thurl, personal observations about classmates are not appropriate for academic discussion." "But, Professor," Jackson continued, emboldened by the attention, "isn't it relevant to question these theoretical capabilities when we have a live example present? I've observed the human for 3 months now, and I've seen no evidence of enhanced anything. She's quiet, keeps to herself, and frankly seems rather—" He searched for a word. "Fragile." Sarah's fingers drummed silently against her desk, a habit she'd developed to channel nervous energy. She could feel the familiar weight of her emergency kit in her jacket pocket, standard equipment for any human venturing far from Earth. Most aliens didn't know about such kits, assuming they contained simple medical supplies. They weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. "Perhaps," came another voice from the front of the classroom, "we should test this theory directly." Sarah's attention snapped to the speaker. Kravex Mordain, a saurian from the aggressive hegemony worlds. His species evolved from apex predators, and their society valued strength above all else. Unlike Jackson's pale, elongated frame, Kravex was built like a crocodile that had learned to walk upright, complete with thick scales, powerful muscles, and a mouth full of pointed teeth. Professor Velkin's silver skin rippled with alarm. "Mr. Mordain, what exactly are you suggesting?" Kravex rose from his seat, his 7-foot frame casting a shadow across several rows of students. "A practical demonstration. If Deathworlders truly possess these enhanced abilities, surely the human won't object to a simple test." The classroom fell silent except for the gentle hum of the environmental systems. Sarah could smell the sudden spike of fear pheromones from some of her classmates, while others leaned forward with anticipation. She recognized the look in Kravex's reptilian eyes. She'd seen it before in the wildlife preserves back on Earth, in the moments before a predator decided to test a potential threat. "That's really not necessary," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension building in the room. "Oh, but I think it is," Kravex replied, his clawed hand moving to his belt. "You see, human, I come from a world where we believe in proving one's worth through action, not theory." Professor Velkin started to intervene, but Kravex was already moving. With surprising speed for his size, he vaulted over 2 rows of seats, landing in the aisle beside Sarah's desk. Several students scrambled backward, their various forms of locomotion creating a chaos of movement. "Mr. Mordain, return to your seat immediately," Professor Velkin commanded, her wings spreading wide in a display of authority. But Kravex wasn't listening. His hand moved to his utility belt and withdrew something that made several students gasp. It was a ceremonial blade from his homeworld, about 8 inches long with a curved, serrated edge designed for both cutting and ripping. The metal gleamed with an oily sheen that suggested it had been treated with something unpleasant. "On my world," Kravex said, holding the blade casually but prominently, "we have a saying. The strength of the predator is revealed only when the prey believes itself safe." His lipless mouth curved into what might have been a smile. "I'm curious to see what the little Deathworlder does when she realizes she's not safe at all." Sarah looked up at the towering Saurian, noting the way he held the blade, the positioning of his feet, the slight forward lean of his torso that indicated he was ready to spring into action. Around them, the classroom had devolved into chaos as some students tried to flee while others pulled out their communication devices to call for security. Professor Velkin was shouting something about academy regulations and immediate expulsion, but her words seemed distant and unimportant. Sarah's world had narrowed to the immediate threat in front of her, the way it always did when her Deathworld instincts kicked in. And then, to everyone's surprise, Sarah smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile or even a nervous one. It was the kind of smile that would have been perfectly at home on the face of a great white shark or a tiger that had just spotted a particularly fat deer. It was a smile that spoke of absolute confidence in one's ability to handle whatever was about to happen. "You know, Kravex," she said, her voice carrying a new quality that made several students stop trying to flee and start paying attention. "That's a beautiful blade. The craftsmanship is really impressive." Kravex blinked, clearly not expecting compliments. Yes, it was forged by the master smiths of my clan." "The edgework is particularly nice," Sarah continued, settling back in her chair as if she were discussing the weather rather than being threatened with a weapon. "Though I have to ask, is that a neurotoxin coating or just a paralytic agent?" The question caught Kravex so off guard that he actually looked down at his blade. "How could you possibly—" "Oh, I recognize the smell," Sarah said casually. "We have similar compounds on Earth, though honestly, for a classroom demonstration, I would have gone with something a bit more educational." She reached into her jacket pocket and Kravex tensed, raising his blade defensively. But what Sarah withdrew made the entire classroom fall silent. It was a knife, but not like anything they had ever seen before. The blade was about 6 inches long, made from what appeared to be some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The edge was so sharp it appeared to cut through the air itself, and the handle was wrapped in what looked like actual leather, a material most galactic citizens only knew from historical texts. "This," Sarah said, holding the knife with the casual familiarity of someone who had carried it for years, "is a K-bar combat knife. It's a design that's been used by Earth's military forces for over 200 years. She turned it slightly and the deadly edge caught the classroom lighting. The steel is folded over 9,000 times, hardened in a process that involves temperatures hot enough to melt most metals and sharpened to a molecular edge." Kravex stared at the weapon, then at Sarah's face, trying to process what he was seeing. The small, quiet human girl had just produced a blade that radiated lethality in a way that made his ceremonial weapon look like a child's toy. But here's the really interesting part, Sarah continued, standing up from her desk with fluid grace. As she moved, Kravex noticed for the first time how she carried herself. Not like prey, but like something that had never been prey in its entire evolutionary history. This knife has killed things that would eat saurians as appetizers. Professor Velkin had stopped shouting about regulations and was now staring in fascination, her academic mind overriding her concern for classroom safety. "Earth, you see," Sarah said, beginning to pace slowly around Kravex, "isn't just a high-gravity world. It's a world where everything, and I mean everything, is trying to kill you. We have spiders whose bite causes flesh to rot away from the bone. We have jellyfish that can stop a heart with a single touch. We have weather patterns that can level entire cities, predators that hunt in packs and never stop pursuing their prey, and diseases that make the Rigelian death plague look like a mild cold." As she spoke, Kravex found himself turning to keep her in sight, and he realized with growing alarm that somehow, despite being nearly 3 feet shorter than him, Sarah had gained the psychological advantage in their confrontation. "Every human child," Sarah continued, "learns to identify dozens of different ways to die before they learn to walk properly. We grow up in an environment so hostile that most galactic species would require environmental suits just to visit our nature preserves. And the really beautiful part is that we don't just survive in this environment, we thrive in it." She stopped directly in front of Kravex again, looking up at him with those dark human eyes that suddenly seemed far more predatory than they had moments before. "So when you ask whether Deathworlders have enhanced capabilities," she said, her smile returning, "you're asking the wrong question. The right question is, what happens when you take an apex predator from the most dangerous world in known space and give it access to galactic technology and education?" The knife in her hand moved, and Kravex's eyes widened as he tried to follow the motion. But Sarah's hand seemed to blur, the blade moving in patterns too fast for his eyes to track. When her hand finally stopped, she was holding the knife in a reverse grip, the blade lying flat along her forearm, a position that would allow for both defensive blocks and devastating close-range attacks. "The answer," she said softly, "is that you get someone like me." For a moment, the only sound in the classroom was the gentle hum of the air recycling systems. Then Kravex, veteran of countless dominance battles on his homeworld, slowly and carefully placed his ceremonial blade on the nearest desk and stepped backward with his hands raised. "I believe," he said quietly, "that I have learned enough about Deathworld adaptations for today." Sarah's predatory smile softened back into something more human and approachable. "Oh, good, because we haven't even gotten to the really interesting parts yet." Professor Velkin's wings had settled into a position that indicated both fascination and deep concern. The Etherian approached slowly, her silver eyes fixed on the knife in Sarah's hand. "Miss Chen, while that was certainly educational, I must ask you to secure your weapon and return to your seat." Sarah nodded respectfully, but instead of simply putting the knife away, she held it up where the entire class could see it clearly. "Actually, Professor, if you don't mind, I think this might be a perfect opportunity for a practical lesson in xenobiology and cultural adaptation." Several students were still pressed against the far walls of the classroom, while others had crept closer, drawn by curiosity that overcame their fear. Jackson Thorell remained frozen in his seat, his pale blue skin having shifted to an almost white shade that indicated extreme stress among his species. "You see," Sarah began, her voice taking on the tone of a lecturer, "what just happened here is a perfect example of how different environments shape not just physical evolution, but psychological and cultural development as well. She turned the knife slowly in her hand, and the class could see that despite its obviously lethal nature, she handled it with the casual familiarity someone might show with a stylus or datapad. Kravex, your species evolved from apex predators, correct? The saurian nodded slowly, his reptilian eyes never leaving the blade. The bloodtail saurians of Hegemony Prime. We were the dominant species on our world for over 2 million years. And that dominance was maintained through physical intimidation and displays of strength, Sarah continued. Your ceremonial blade, for instance, is designed not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of your status and capability. The neurotoxin coating serves to incapacitate rather than kill outright, because on your world, the goal is to establish dominance, not necessarily to eliminate threats. Professor Velkin found herself nodding despite her concern. An excellent analysis, Miss Chen. But I fail to see how this relates to— Earth is different, Sarah interrupted gently. On Earth, there is no such thing as a non-lethal threat. When a human faces danger, we have evolved to respond with overwhelming force because anything less than total commitment means death. She moved to the center of the classroom, and students instinctively gave her space while still straining to hear every word. This knife represents over 10,000 years of human metallurgy and combat experience. But more than that, it represents a fundamental truth about my species. We don't fight to establish dominance. We fight to survive, and survival means making sure the threat can never threaten us again. Kravex shifted uncomfortably. But surely your species must have some concept of mercy, of restraint. Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. Oh, we absolutely do. Humans are capable of extraordinary compassion, forgiveness, and cooperation. In fact, we're one of the most socially complex species in the galaxy. But here's the thing that most other species don't understand about us. She paused, looking around the room to make sure she had everyone's attention. Our capacity for mercy is directly proportional to our certainty that we can defend ourselves if that mercy is misplaced. A human who knows they can win a fight is the most generous creature in the galaxy. A human who thinks they might lose is the most dangerous thing in the known universe. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before a new voice spoke up. Is that why humans have been so successful in diplomatic relations? The speaker was Thais, a crystalline being from the Silicon Reaches whose species communicated through harmonic vibrations. She rarely spoke in class, preferring to observe and analyze. Partially, Sarah acknowledged. When other species look at human diplomatic delegations, they see beings who are typically smaller, less armored, and apparently less threatening than most galactic races. What they don't see is that every human diplomat knows that if negotiations fail, their species has the capability to crack planets. A ripple of unease went through the classroom. Several species had heard rumors about human military capabilities, but few had ever heard them discussed so matter-of-factly. But surely, Jackson finally spoke, his voice shaky, that's just theoretical capability. I mean, no civilized species would actually— Sarah's laugh was not unkind, but it held an edge that made several students flinch. Jackson, my species invented a weapon so terrible that we used it exactly twice, saw what it could do, and then spent the next 3 centuries making sure we never had to use it again. We call them nuclear weapons, and they work by literally tearing apart the fundamental forces that hold matter together. She gestured toward the window that showed the peaceful academy campus spread out under the alien sun. Every human colony ship that left Earth carried enough nuclear weapons to sterilize any planet they might land on. Not because we wanted to destroy worlds, but because we refused to ever again be in a position where we couldn't defend ourselves. Professor Velkin's wings fluttered with what her species used to indicate deep philosophical contemplation. But Miss Chen, surely the Academy's principles of peaceful cooperation and mutual understanding? are absolutely genuine, Sarah finished. Humans believe deeply in peace, Professor, but we define peace differently than most species. She held up the knife again. This blade has never been drawn in anger during my time here at the Academy. In fact, I hope it never needs to be. But the fact that I carry it, and that every person in this room now knows I carry it, makes peaceful resolution more likely, not less. Kravex slowly straightened to his full height. You're saying that your species maintains peace through the promise of overwhelming violence? I'm saying that my species learned a long time ago that if you want peace, you prepare for war. Sarah's expression grew more serious. Earth's history is filled with examples of societies that chose to trust in the goodness of others rather than their own strength. Do you know what we call those societies, Kravex? The Saurian shook his massive head. Extinct. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Several students exchanged glances, beginning to understand that their quiet human classmate represented something far more complex and potentially dangerous than they had ever imagined. But here's the beautiful part, Sarah continued, her voice warming again. Because humans know we can defend ourselves, we're free to be genuinely kind, generous, and trusting. We can afford to give others the benefit of the doubt because we're not vulnerable if that trust is misplaced. She finally slid the knife back into its sheath inside her jacket, the motion so smooth and practiced that it was clear she'd done it thousands of times. Which brings us back to today's lesson in xenobiology. Professor Velkin blinked in surprise. I'm sorry? Adaptation, Sarah explained. Every species adapts to their environment. Kravex's people adapted to a world where strength determined survival, so they developed intimidation displays and dominance behaviors. Jackson's people adapted to a world where resources were abundant and conflict was rare, so they developed complex social negotiations and cooperative structures. She gestured to the diverse collection of beings around the classroom. Each of you represents millions of years of evolution shaped by the specific challenges of your homeworld. But here's what makes this classroom so remarkable. Sarah paused, looking at each of her classmates in turn. Despite coming from radically different environments with completely different evolutionary pressures, we're all here together, learning from each other. Kravex could have chosen to escalate our confrontation into actual violence. Jackson could have fled instead of staying to learn. Professor Velkin could have called security instead of allowing this to become a teaching moment. She smiled, and this time it was the warm, genuine expression her classmates were more familiar with. The fact that we can bridge these differences, that we can learn from each other despite our evolutionary programming, is proof that intelligence and education can overcome instinct. It's proof that the galaxy really can work as a cooperative community. Theis's crystalline form chimed with harmonics that indicated deep appreciation. So humans carry weapons not because they want to use them, but because knowing they could use them allows them to choose not to. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. A human with a knife who knows how to use it is more likely to find peaceful solutions than a human who's helpless. Strength breeds confidence, and confidence enables restraint. Kravex was nodding slowly, his predator's mind grasping the logic even as it challenged his cultural assumptions. Your species has weaponized security itself. In a way, yes. But remember, the ultimate goal is never to need to use those weapons. Every human military academy teaches the same fundamental principle. The best battle is the one that never has to be fought. Professor Velkin had been listening with growing fascination, her academic mind racing through the implications. Miss Chen, this is quite possibly the most enlightening practical demonstration I've ever witnessed. But I do need to ask, are all humans equipped as you are? Sarah considered the question carefully. Every human learns basic survival skills, yes, but the level of preparation varies based on their role and environment. A human diplomat might carry different tools than a human explorer, who would carry different tools than a human living on a peaceful colony world. She patted her jacket where the knife was concealed. I carry what I carry because I'm currently the only human on a station with over 40 different species, many of whom I'd never encountered before coming here. My preparation is calibrated to the level of uncertainty in my environment. And if you were back on Earth? Jackson asked, his curiosity finally overcoming his fear. Sarah's grin was almost mischievous. On Earth, this knife would be considered a basic utility tool. You really don't want to know what humans consider serious weapons. The silence that followed was broken by the soft chime of the class period ending. Students began gathering their materials. But the atmosphere was completely different than it had been an hour ago. Instead of the casual chatter typical of the end of a lecture, there was a sense of thoughtful contemplation. As students filed toward the exit, several approached Sarah. This was the first, her crystalline form singing with harmonics of respect and curiosity. Would you be willing to discuss more about human adaptation strategies sometime? My species finds your approach to uncertainty management quite fascinating. Of course, Sarah replied warmly. I'd love to learn more about Silicon Reach survival strategies in return. Kravex approached more hesitantly, his massive frame somehow managing to look almost humble. Human Sarah, he said formally, I owe you an apology. I mistook restraint for weakness and preparation for paranoia. My clan would say I have learned a valuable lesson today. No apology necessary, Sarah assured him. You acted according to your cultural programming, just like I did. The fact that we could work through our differences without anyone getting hurt is what matters. As the last students filed out, Professor Velkin approached Sarah with her datapad in hand. Miss Chen, I hope you realize that what happened here today was quite extraordinary. I've been teaching xenobiology for over 30 years, and I've never seen such a clear demonstration of how environment shapes behavior. Thank you, Professor. Though I should mention that everything I described today is covered in pretty standard human educational materials. If the Academy would like, I could probably arrange for some guest lecturers from Earth to provide more formal instruction. Professor Velkin's wings fluttered with excitement. That would be absolutely fascinating, though I think we might want to start with some preliminary safety briefings for the other students. Sarah laughed as she gathered her belongings. Probably a good idea. Though honestly, Professor, what happened today was pretty mild by human standards. If you really want to understand Deathworld adaptations, we should probably start with something less controversial than knife fighting. Less controversial? Oh, yes. Today we only talked about individual survival strategies. If you really want to see what makes humans dangerous, you need to understand how we work as a group. As they left the classroom together, Professor Velkin found herself both excited and slightly apprehensive about what future lessons might bring. Behind them, the empty classroom seemed somehow different, as if the very air held an echo of the lesson in adaptation and survival that had taken place within its walls. 3 days after what Academy students had begun calling the knife incident, Sarah found herself sitting in Dean Vorthak's office, facing a tribunal that included representatives from 5 different species and the Academy's Board of Interspecies Relations. The Vorlak Dean sat behind his massive desk like a mountain of chitinous armor, his 4 eyes studying her with the intensity of a creature that had evolved to spot threats from vast distances. Miss Chen, Dean Vorthak began, his voice carrying the harmonics that allowed his species to communicate across the vacuum of space. While Professor Velkin's report describes yesterday's events as educationally significant, several parents and governmental representatives have expressed concerns about human students carrying what they term military-grade weaponry in civilian educational settings. Sarah sat calmly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. She had expected this meeting, had in fact been somewhat surprised it had taken 3 days to materialize. Dean Vorthak I understand their concerns, and I'm happy to address them. Board member Quintessa Lyrith, an elegant Celestine with skin that seemed to contain actual starlight, leaned forward. Miss Chen, our investigation into human manufacturing techniques suggests that the weapon you displayed could penetrate the natural armor of at least 47 different species represented at this academy. Several parents are asking why humans are permitted to carry devices capable of killing their children. That's actually an excellent question, Sarah replied, her tone respectful but confident. And the answer requires understanding something fundamental about human psychology and our approach to risk management. She looked around the table, meeting the eyes, optical sensors, and sensory organs of each board member in turn. Every species here today evolved on worlds with different threat levels and environmental challenges. Most of your homeworlds had perhaps a dozen truly dangerous species that your ancestors needed to worry about. Earth had millions. Dean Vorthak's mandibles clicked together, a sign of interest among his people. Continue. When a Zephyrian child learns about danger, Sarah said, they learn about perhaps 10 or 15 things that could hurt them, most of which can be avoided through careful planning or social cooperation. When a human child learns about danger, they learn about thousands of potential threats, many of which are invisible, unpredictable, or actively hunting them. Board member Krex Thalone, a scaled humanoid whose people prize directness above all else, interrupted. We've read the reports about your homeworld's hostile environment, but surely in a civilized setting like the Academy— Respectfully, Mr. Thalone, Sarah said, that's exactly the thinking that gets humans killed. She paused, choosing her words carefully. May I tell you about the Terran colonial disaster of 2387? The board members exchanged glances before Dean Vorthak nodded permission. The colony ship New Hope launched from Earth with 15,000 human colonists, heading for what surveys had identified as an ideal world. Gaia-class atmosphere, abundant water, mild climate, no large predators or dangerous wildlife. The advanced surveys were conducted by a joint team of human and Altarian scientists, and everyone agreed it was a perfect world for peaceful agricultural development. Sarah's voice took on the tone of someone reciting a cautionary tale that every member of her species knew by heart. The colony was established successfully, crops were planted, settlements were built, and for 6 months everything was perfect. The colonists sent back reports describing it as paradise, exactly the kind of world that humans had always dreamed of finding. And then? Quintessa asked, though her starlight-infused skin was already dimming with apprehension. And then the ecosystem's breeding cycle triggered, Sarah said simply. You see, the planet had a unique evolutionary development. Every 7 years, microscopic parasites that lived dormant in the soil would emerge simultaneously across the entire continent. These parasites were undetectable to standard galactic survey equipment because they weren't active during the survey period. The silence in the room was profound. The parasites would infect any warm-blooded creature they encountered, using them as breeding hosts for a period of approximately 30 days before emerging to continue their life cycle. For the native wildlife, this was simply part of their evolutionary adaptation. They had developed immunity cycles that allowed them to survive the infestation. But the humans hadn't, Dean Vorthak said, his voice very quiet. 15,000 people, Sarah confirmed, dead within 6 weeks, despite having access to the most advanced medical technology available at the time. The Altarian survey team, being cold-blooded, was completely unaffected and couldn't understand why the humans were dying so rapidly. She leaned forward slightly, her expression growing more intense. Now here's the important part. If the human colonists had been carrying standard Earth-level emergency equipment, including weapons, advanced medical scanners, environmental suits, and defensive systems, they might have been able to identify and respond to the threat. But they weren't, because everyone had agreed that it was a safe world that didn't require such precautions. Board member Thylix, whose crystalline people communicated through harmonic resonance, chimed with tones of deep distress. "You're saying that human preparedness protocols exist because your species literally cannot afford to assume safety." "Exactly. When a Zephyrian encounters an unexpected threat, they typically have time to analyze it, consult with others, and develop a careful response plan. When a human encounters an unexpected threat, we have perhaps seconds to respond effectively. And our response has to account for the possibility that this threat is just the first indicator of something much worse." Sarah reached into her jacket and slowly withdrew her knife, placing it on the table where everyone could see it clearly. Several board members tensed, but she kept her hands well away from the weapon. "This knife represents approximately 30 seconds of emergency response capability," she said. "It's designed to cut through environmental hazards, serve as a basic tool for emergency shelter construction, and yes, if absolutely necessary, stop a threat to my life. But more importantly, it represents something that every human carries in their mind: the knowledge that safety is always temporary and preparation is the only reliable defense against uncertainty." Dean Vorthak studied the weapon with his multiple eyes. "And you believe that carrying such implements actually makes you less likely to need to use them?" "Dean, in the 3 months I've been at this academy, I've encountered 47 different species, each with their own communication styles, cultural expectations, and behavioral patterns. Some of those species are naturally more aggressive than others. Some have territorial instincts. Some have predatory responses triggered by specific movements or sounds." She gestured around the room. "Every day I navigate an environment filled with beings who could accidentally or intentionally cause me serious harm, simply because we evolved in completely different ways. The fact that I'm prepared to defend myself if necessary means I can afford to be relaxed, friendly, and trusting in my daily interactions." "And if you weren't prepared?" Quintessa asked. "If I weren't prepared, I would have to treat every interaction as a potential threat. I would have to maintain constant vigilance, avoid close contact with classmates, and limit my participation in social activities. Paradoxically, being armed allows me to be more peaceful, not less." Board member Krex was nodding slowly, his warrior culture beginning to grasp the logic. "Your weapon is a tool for enabling trust." "In part, yes. But there's another aspect that I think you need to understand about human group dynamics." Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Humans don't just prepare as individuals. We prepare as communities, as societies, and as a species." She stood up and walked to the large window that looked out over the academy campus, where students from dozens of species could be seen moving between buildings, studying together, and engaging in various recreational activities. "What happened in Professor Velkin's classroom wasn't just about me being prepared to defend myself. It was about me demonstrating to every student present that humans can be trusted to respond proportionally to threats. When Kravex escalated to potentially lethal force, I showed that I could match that escalation, but I also showed that I preferred de-escalation." "How do you mean?" Dean Vorthak asked. "I could have drawn my knife the moment Kravex stood up. Human combat doctrine would actually recommend that approach. Establish overwhelming superiority immediately to prevent the situation from developing further. But instead, I allowed him to reveal his weapon first, then demonstrated that his threat level was insufficient to actually threaten me." Sarah turned back to the board members. "By doing so, I communicated several things simultaneously. First, that humans are not easily intimidated. Second, that we prefer peaceful resolution when possible. Third, that we're capable of calibrating our response to match the actual level of threat rather than simply defaulting to maximum force." The implications of this hung in the air as the board members considered what they had heard. You're describing a form of diplomatic signaling, Quintessa said slowly, but using personal combat capability as the medium of communication. Yes, but it goes deeper than that, Sarah replied. By demonstrating restraint while clearly possessing overwhelming capability, I was also representing my entire species. Every alien student in that classroom now knows that humans can be trusted to honor the Academy's principles of peaceful cooperation even when we're threatened. Dean Vorthak's mandibles clicked rapidly, indicating deep thought. And if you had been unprepared? If you had been unable to respond to Mr. Mordain's threat? Then every student would have learned that humans can be safely intimidated through displays of force. Some species would have lost respect for humanity as a potential partner or ally. Others would have seen us as potential victims to be exploited. And a few would have concluded that humans are weak enough to be ignored entirely in future political or social calculations. She returned to her seat, picking up her knife and returning it to its concealment within her jacket. The result would have been increased tensions, reduced cooperation, and a general degradation of interspecies relations throughout the Academy. So your preparedness serves not just your own safety, but the diplomatic standing of your entire species, Thylix chimed in harmonics of understanding. Exactly. And this brings me to the point that Professor Velkin mentioned about human group dynamics. Sarah's expression grew more animated. Individual human preparedness is actually the least impressive aspect of our species' survival strategy. What makes humans truly formidable is what happens when we work together. The board members leaned forward almost unconsciously. Every human at this academy is in constant communication with Earth, with human colonies, and with human trade vessels throughout this sector of the galaxy. We share information, coordinate responses to problems, and maintain supply lines that can deliver anything from medical supplies to military support within days of a request being made. She smiled, but there was something in her expression that made several board members suddenly remember that she was, in fact, a member of a species that had fought its way to the top of the food chain on one of the most dangerous worlds in known space. The knife I carry represents my individual capability. But behind me stands the entire human species, with all of our technology, experience, and resources. When other species look at a human and wonder whether we're a threat, they're not just evaluating one individual. They're evaluating whether they want to potentially come into conflict with a species that turned a Deathworld into a garden and then spread across the galaxy in less than 5 centuries. The silence in the room stretched until Dean Vorthak finally spoke. Miss Chen, are you suggesting that human students serve as diplomatic representatives as well as academic participants? I'm suggesting that every interaction between species is inherently diplomatic, whether we acknowledge it or not. The question is whether we approach those interactions from a position of strength that enables generosity and cooperation, or from a position of vulnerability that breeds suspicion and conflict. Board member Kreck straightened to his full height, his scaled features showing the kind of respect his people reserved for worthy opponents. I withdraw my objection to human preparedness protocols. A species that can produce warriors who choose to be scholars is a species that deserves to be treated as equals. Quintessa's starlight skin was brightening again. I agree. Though I think we should consider developing a cultural exchange program that helps other species understand human approaches to risk management. Actually, Sarah said, I've been working on a proposal for exactly that kind of program. If you're interested, I could have it ready for review by next week. Dean Vorthak's 4 eyes focused on her with new interest. What would such a program entail? Essentially, it would be a series of workshops where human students could demonstrate and explain our survival techniques, risk assessment methods, and cooperative strategies. But more importantly, it would give students from other species the opportunity to share their own cultural approaches to safety and security. She stood up again, her expression becoming more enthusiastic. Imagine if Kravex could teach a class on dominance, signaling, and conflict de-escalation from a Saurian perspective, or if Jackson could demonstrate Zephyrian cooperative negotiation techniques. We could create an environment where every species' survival strategies are understood and appreciated rather than feared or dismissed. The board members began exchanging glances and quiet communications in their various languages. Such a program could significantly reduce interspecies tensions throughout the Academy, Thylix noted with harmonics of approval, and provide valuable research data on comparative survival strategies across multiple worlds, added Quintessa. Dean Vorthak's mandibles clicked in what his people used to indicate decision-making. Miss Chen, I hereby authorize you to develop your proposal in full. If it meets our educational and safety standards, we will implement it as a pilot program next semester. Thank you, Dean. I think you'll find that when species understand each other's survival strategies, cooperation becomes much more natural. As Sarah left the Dean's office, she couldn't help but smile. She had come to the Academy to learn about other species and their worlds. Instead, she had ended up teaching them about humanity, and in the process, she had probably just made the galaxy a slightly safer place for everyone. Behind her, the board members were already deep in discussion about the implications of what they had learned. For the first time, many of them were beginning to understand that the quiet human students scattered throughout the Academy weren't just representatives of their species. They were proof that intelligence and preparation could create strength that enabled true peace. And in classrooms throughout the Academy, students from dozens of different worlds were having conversations about cooperation, preparedness, and the surprising discovery that the most peaceful beings were often those who were most capable of defending themselves. The knife had stayed sheathed, but its lesson would ripple through the galaxy for generations to come.